Hi, I'm Pattie Fitzgerald from Safely Ever After. As a parent, I know we are all scared about this topic of sexual abuse and how to protect our kids from it. So today's video, An Ounce of Prevention, is all about safety tips to empower us, to empower our kids, to educate them, and to protect them from what I call tricky people. The first thing I need to tell you is it's not about fear. This is not me telling you that you should be afraid of everyone and that everyone is a child molester, because that's simply not true. Today is about awareness and action. So first, what is the definition of childhood sexual abuse? It's broader than you might think. Sexual abuse of children is any type of abuse, molestation, touching, exploitation of children for the purposes of someone else's sexual gratification. It's highly traumatic and it is a crime, something we all need to remember. So if we want to keep kids safe, it isn't rocket science. The three-step approach. The first step, learn the facts, understand the risks. So the first fact that parents need to know, 90% of childhood sexual abuse happens to kids by somebody they know, not by a stranger. And this is why I don't do stranger danger classes. I teach parents, I teach kids how to watch out for tricky people. Tricky people who give you an uh-oh feeling. Tricky people who try and trick you into gaining more access and private time with your child. Unfortunately, another statistic is that around 95% of abusers are male. So I mean, no disrespect if I say he throughout the program, but statistically, more molesters are male. However, there are female predators and female molesters, and so if you're ever getting an uh-oh, uncomfortable feeling from a female, it's important to listen to that instinct as well. So that's our first step, understanding the facts and understanding that it's not stranger danger we should be teaching our kids. The second step is a big one. The second step is minimize the opportunity, minimize the risk, and that's our job as parents. It's not a kid's job to keep themselves safe. Their job, their portion in child safety is to learn some safety rules, some things that I call thumbs up and thumbs down behaviors in other people so that they can recognize when something's not quite right and tell you about it. But as a parent, as an adult, we have to do the heavy lifting. Our job is to minimize the risk that our children could ever spend alone time with a tricky person. Two elements must be present if somebody wants to target a child. If someone wants to sexually abuse a child, they need access and privacy. So you're going to hear me talk about that a lot today. Access and privacy, access and privacy. This doesn't mean that you can't allow your child to have some one-on-one time with another adult, but be smart about who is allowed that privilege of alone time. In plain English, pay attention to who's paying attention to your kid. If my mother wants to take my daughter to the movie, that's okay. But who's asking what? Be mindful if someone is working really hard to gain alone time with your kid, and ask yourself if it makes sense. Is it the new brother-in-law or sister-in-law? The rabbi? The next-door neighbor? Someone who typically would not have alone time with your child? Slow down. Ask yourself if it makes sense and limit access and privacy. If her science teacher or her soccer coach says, oh, she's my favorite one on the team. I'd love to take her to see a movie on Saturday, just me and her, my special buddy. That does not make sense. And here's a clue. Safe adults that work with your kids are not looking for more alone time with your kids, because we don't want to put ourselves in an uncomfortable position where we might be misunderstood or accused of something. But tricky people Well, they look for alone time, and it always comes at you with a smile and a lot of flattery. So just slow down. I'd like to give you an example of how I minimized the opportunity in my own family. When my daughter was about 4 years old, we had a next door neighbor. His name was Mr. Norton. And Mr. Norton didn't look scary. He wasn't married, he didn't have any children, but he had a puppy, and he was a nice enough neighbor. He had some interesting characters walking in and out of his home, but he was nice, and when we saw him outside, we'd wave, and he'd wave, and it was all good. But one day, he saw my daughter Maria in the front yard with me, and he looked at her and he said, "Ooh, Maria, you look sexy today. I wish you were my girlfriend." Yeah. And I just saw the uh-oh feeling on all your faces. You all got that instinct. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound quite right. Uh-oh, somebody just said something that just doesn't make me feel good in relation to my kid. So I got that uh-oh feeling too. When I heard Mr. Norton say, "Maria, you look sexy," and my kid was 4 years old, a couple of things had to happen since he lives right next door to me. So the first thing, note to self, this is not the next door neighbor where I am ever going to ask him to babysit for my daughter for a half an hour while I run to the market really quick. I'm not going to invite him over for coffee and then go in the kitchen and do the dishes while he watches a video with my kid in the living room. And if he suggests things like, "Can I take Maria to get some ice cream after dinner?" I'm going to say, "No, thanks," or "I'm going for ice cream too." So that was the first thing. Listen to your instinct. Your instinct is the best barometer for when something's not quite right. So, note to self. The second thing that had to happen in that Mr. Norton scenario, I had to make sure my daughter understood the very important check first rule. And that's something we want to teach our kids, whether they're 5 years old or 15. Before you go anywhere, do anything, make sure you have permission. Check first. Check first before you go in somebody's house or car or off for a walk. So I worked really hard to make sure Maria understood. Check first if Mr. Norton invites you into the house to play with the puppy or have a snack. And the reason check first is so important is because 90% of the time, it's not a stranger who targets a kid, right? So if Mr. Norton invites her into that house, why wouldn't she go? He's not a stranger. He's friendly. She knows I know him. There's nothing in place to keep her from walking right into his possible trap unless she knows, I got to check first. And that's all we want to teach our kids. All you have to say is, "Sounds good, got to check first." So, note to self, check first. And the last thing, I said something to Mr. Norton. Because the one thing that stops a child predator from targeting your kid is the possibility of getting caught. If they think you're onto them, if they think you're paying attention, that you're one of those pain-in-the-neck parents who says something when it doesn't feel right. So I simply said, "Mr. Norton, you're not supposed to say sexy to a 4-year-old. And I did it with a little smile. Now, I didn't have to call him out and say, "Oh my God, that sounds like such a terrible molester thing." State your truth without blame or judgment. "Mr. Norton, you're not supposed to say sexy to a 4-year-old. And that simply tells Mr. Norton that I'm one of those parents paying attention. So to wrap up that whole scenario of minimizing the risk or the opportunity, I don't know to this day if Mr. Norton is a molester or just maybe not too bright and just thinks I have a sexy 4-year-old. But here's the deal. My focus isn't on Mr. Norton anymore. My focus is on my kid. Not focusing on that person anymore. I got an uh-oh feeling, I'm going with it. My focus is on the kid and making sure she understands some certain rules so that she doesn't find out one way or the other, is he or isn't he? So throughout this program, we'll talk some more about minimizing the risks and the opportunities when you get an uh-oh feeling. And I even will share with you a good story about how I do trust our tennis coach to be alone with my daughter, because it's not about not trusting anyone. The third step in keeping our children safe is to listen and communicate with our kids in a way that works for them. So the first part is communicate with your children about child safety, because molesters are really smart, and they watch and they study families, and they know exactly which kids they can target, which families they better stay away from. They know exactly which parents are little savvy and which ones are far too trusting and naive. So, if you want to put out a vibe that your family is not to be messed with, start using the right terms with kids, and they'll use them back. Things like tricky people, uh-oh feeling, safety rules, thumbs up, thumbs down. This is how you teach children what's okay and not okay, how you empower them and give them a voice, and it doesn't feel scary. Whenever you say stranger danger to a kid, it sounds scary. So not only is it not effective, but it scares them. Tricky people is a far less scary idea, because kids hate to be tricked. They hate to let anybody get one over on them. So we teach kids, watch out for tricky people who break our rules, and those are just some of the ways that you can communicate with your children. The other part about communicating with your kids, download information from your children every day, whether they come home from camp, from school, after spending time at Bubby's house or at a friend's house. Instead of asking, what'd you do today? We all know the answer to that question is nothing. What I want you to do is ask for details. At least three details about how they spent the time when they weren't with you. For example, if I was doing this in my family, I would say to Maria, Maria, tell me 3 things you did at school today, or 3 things you did at camp today, and I'll tell you 3 things about my day, and I'll go first. Oh, I had a great day. I had lunch with my friend Karen for her birthday. I was the first person in line at the post office, so I didn't have to wait a long time. And oh yeah, somebody almost hit my car in the parking lot. That gave me an uh-oh feeling. Now I want Maria to give me her 3 things, because all I'm doing is listening for anything that sounds off, anything that makes me think, uh-oh, I need to step in and say something to someone because I have to minimize the risk or the opportunity. So I'm listening for things. And if Maria says, oh, I had a great day today. I got an A on my spelling test, and we had hamburgers for lunch, and they were delicious. And oh yeah, I'm the favorite student of the PE teacher. And so after class, I stayed in the office and we played the pocket game together, and I got a new whistle. The pocket game. You might not hear about the pocket game if you don't download information from your kid every day. And the pocket game is simply one of the oldest tricks in the book when a molester wants to get handsy with a kid. They put a toy or a treat in their pocket and they try and reach in there for it. Or they put it in their own pocket and have the child reach in to the adult's pocket. It's a yucky physical boundary blur. Uncle Creepy loves the pocket game. Molesters love the pocket game because it's an easy way to get frisky. So if you hear about an accidental touching game like the pocket game, you know that's uh-oh. Take an action. All righty? So that's how you communicate with your kids. I used to love to ask my child, who got in trouble today? Oh, they love to tell you that, and it encourages dialogue. Who'd you eat lunch with? Who made you happy today? Who made you mad today? Get details. The other thing is listen to your child. If they tell you that they have an uh-oh feeling about someone else, please don't talk your child out of it. They may have an uh-oh feeling about Uncle Creepy or Cousin Yucky or their soccer coach because they heard something or experienced something that maybe you didn't witness. So if a child comes to you and says, you know, I really don't like so-and-so, he's kind of yucky, or gives me an uh-oh feeling, simply say, thank you, I'm so glad you told me. Tell me more. But don't say, oh, that's just how he is and he doesn't mean anything, because the more you talk your child out of their uh-oh feeling, the less it's going to go off. And the less likely they are to tell you about it, because it feels like Mom and Dad don't have my back. So keeping our kids safe, as I mentioned, is not rocket science. Learn the facts, minimize the risk, communicate in the right way with your children. And one last thing about communication, every expert, pediatrician, child safety educator will recommend that we use the anatomically correct words for body parts. I know that some parents are not comfortable with those words. If you're not, simply use the term private parts. But please don't nickname these special parts of our bodies with cutesy little nicknames that desensitize a child. So either the anatomically correct words or simply private parts. Okay? Good? So just a few more facts. 90% somebody the kids know. Over 34% are family members. That's why I always refer to Uncle Creepy, Cousin Yucky, the rabbi, the pillar of the community. Another very important fact is that children with disabilities are far more likely to experience some type of sexual abuse, usually because there's some communication issues or they might have a hard time reading other cues. So know who your child is. And by that, I simply mean know what they're like. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Know what you're working with, because you may really have to put in some very, very strong boundaries around your child. 89% of sexual abuse happens to kids through what we call the grooming process. Grooming is a term you may or may not be familiar with, and it's simply this. Grooming is all of that preliminary charm, attention, affection, ingratiating themselves into your family system to slowly gain more access and more privacy. Grooming is something like a soccer coach who insists on driving your kid home after soccer every week. Now, the first week, that soccer coach probably won't do anything. Maybe he'll take your kid out for ice cream and say, shh, don't tell, it's a secret. The second week, if you will continue to allow it, that soccer coach may get a little frisky or use some language to desensitize your child. And this grooming process will go on until the child's trust is in that person, until they've gained your trust, and then they move in for the molestation or the exploitation. So the grooming process is basically a sex offender setting the stage and doing his prep work ahead of time to gain access. There are a lot of red flag warning signs when grooming is taking place, and they're in that handout that I gave everyone. Things like people looking for more alone time, too much attention, flattery, somebody who is too physical, especially when the kids don't like it, somebody who's always offering to babysit for free, someone who's always giving your child super expensive gifts for no reason. So be mindful of these red flag grooming tricks. Now, one red flag grooming trick doesn't mean a molester, call the police, but it means pay attention to that person's relationship with your kid. And if you see more than one red flag grooming trick in someone's behavior, you're done. No more access, no more privacy. As yucky as the grooming process is, it actually works in our favor as parents because it buys us time to recognize when somebody is not okay, and we can stop it before it moves into the molestation or victimization of a child. So think of the grooming process as a simple stage one, setting the stage, setting the ground rules, and we're going to beat that molester at his own game. Okay? So now we've talked about some of the facts surrounding childhood sexual abuse. Let's talk about some of the myths, because the myths are what child predators count on us believing so they can continue to access our children. So what are some of these myths? Well, predators want you to believe that it's only strangers or weirdos, that it's never that nice uncle or next door neighbor or pillar of the community, that it's never the rabbi or the religious leader in the community, that it can only be some odd person, probably with a weapon, and that it's never that nice next door neighbor boy who likes to play with your kids. Throw these myths right out the window. In fact, it's just the opposite. The people who molest our children have infiltrated our family system, and it usually is the soccer coach, the next door neighbor, the relative, the rabbi or religious leader. And that's a hard one to take, and I understand that. But if we close our eyes and only listen to those myths and only believe those myths, we are doing such a disservice to our children. So, who are the offenders? Well, as I mentioned earlier, 95% male, 5% female. And they're people in our families. They're people that work with our children. So once again, just pay attention to who's paying attention to your kid. And don't be afraid to say something if you have an uh-oh feeling. How could this happen? I get more phone calls from clients saying, I can't believe it. He was so nice. He was so great. Everybody trusted him. Well, of course, because that's part of the trick. So how could it happen? Well, two things were present: access and privacy. And please remember that just because somebody is nice doesn't mean they can't be a molester. The two are not mutually exclusive, unfortunately. In fact, they usually go together. So if someone is too good to be true, you might want to take a look at that person, especially in relationship to your child. So one of the things that I'm lucky enough to do in my work is to go straight to the source and talk to survivors and talk to molesters and get the straight scoop on how they do what they do, so that I can come back to parents and tell you how they play the game so that we can beat them. So I asked, what's the one thing that would have stopped you? What's the one thing that would deter a predator from targeting a child? They all said the same thing: the possibility of being caught. If they thought somebody was onto them, that somebody was paying attention, that that child seemed a little empowered and not so easily tricked or led, they left that family alone. So our job is to get better at this than the molester. They're really good at knowing who they can target and who they can't. So, one molester who was interviewed actually said, I would never bother with a kid who said to me, you shouldn't touch me like that. He said, parents are so naive. And he said, I know exactly which kids know enough to stop me. So simply teaching your kid that it's okay to say to anyone, hey, you shouldn't touch me like that, is enough to deter a child predator sometimes. This predator that we interviewed, we call him Richard R. Well, he said, tell parents to be visible parents. Put out a vibe that you're involved. Get to know the people who interact with your child. Introduce yourself and be that person who's around during soccer, during different types of activities. You don't have to stay for the whole thing, but put that vibe out there that you're there and that you could show up again at any minute. Introduce yourself to that person and give them a little red flag warning of your own. For example, this is what I used to do. When my daughter was younger and she had a soccer coach, I just introduced myself to the soccer coach and I said, "Hey, I'm Pattie. I'm Maria's mom. We love talking about soccer. Such a soccer family. I can't wait to hear what you all are going to do this season." It just tells that person, this is a family that talks. Back to school night, whether it was the principal, the teacher, even the PE coach, I would just introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Pattie, Maria's mom. So glad she has you for 3rd grade. She loves talking about school. I can't wait to hear about all the things you're doing this year." And you don't have to say it like a crazy person. Just state your truth without blame or judgment and a little smile. Because a safe person will think, "Oh, okay, we've got an involved parent, who cares?" And a tricky person will think, "Ugh, can't mess with this family. That's a paying attention parent." So we want to kind of be what I call a pain in the neck. All righty? Richard R. also said, give kids scripted lines for what to say if they ever get a thumbs down touch. And a thumbs down touch can be anything that makes a kid feel yucky. So obviously a thumbs down touch can be a touch on a private part. But a thumbs down touch can also be if your child doesn't want a shoulder massage or doesn't want to sit on somebody's lap or doesn't feel like getting a very long, squishy hug. Those are physical boundaries that sometimes predators blur to get physical. Richard R. said, always teach your kid what to say because they need to be able to put a vibe out themselves. So teach your children it's okay to say, "Hands off my body." And you'll notice I do this a lot because it's very empowering for a kid to be able to do this, put some distance between them and their predator. And it's empowering and it's a fun way to teach your kid. So let them know, you get to say, "Hands off. Don't touch me. Stop touching me." That's one the kids love to say. We practice that a lot in my kid workshops. "Stop touching me. Stop touching me. Hands off." You can even say, "Hands off my private parts." Or, "My parents told me that's not okay." Any of those statements that you can get your child comfortable with are brilliant clue to a predator. Don't mess with this kid. And that's advice straight from a convicted sex offender. So, we talked about the grooming patterns and the grooming technique a little bit. Be mindful of people who put a lot of pressure on you or make you feel guilty when you try to establish a boundary for your kid. So if your child doesn't feel like sitting on someone's lap and that person makes you or your child feel guilty, it's important for the parent to step in and model the right response so your child gets the message and that other person. So all you have to say is, "Hey, Uncle Joe, Maria doesn't want to sit on your lap, and we've taught her she's the boss of her body. Nothing personal." But let that child and let that adult know we have permission to speak our voice. Some of the other red flag warning signs of grooming are things like that next door neighbor who has no children of his own, but is the most popular person in the neighborhood with all the latest gadgets and games and things that kids like. And then he just gathers everybody all the time. Just has all the kids around in his house. Basically what he's doing is figuring out which kid he can target and which kid he better not. Which parent comes over a lot or tells their kid, "Hurry up and get home." Another red flag grooming sign or red flag warning sign would be someone who has no age-appropriate relationships, but they're always with much younger children. A red flag grooming sign would be somebody who introduces language to your child that is not appropriate. So if your child comes home and has new words for body parts or has inappropriate sexual knowledge and you either overhear them telling their friends or they ask you about it, you know somebody has talked to them about that. And that's how you desensitize a child. So we want to be mindful of these red flag warning signs, and that means paying attention to how somebody acts. If you want to know how to spot a tricky person, here's how. It's not what they look like. It's what they say. It's how they act. So in plain English, you've heard this before, you can't judge a book by its cover. It's the same thing with tricky people. And that's what we teach kids, and that's what adults need to know too. So for more red flag warning signs, go to my website, safelyeverafter.com, or simply refer to the booklet that you're going to get with this workshop. Here's a big one. Why don't kids tell? This one is heartbreaking for me as a child advocate because I hear it all the time. That kid must be lying, that rabbi or teacher or pillar of the community molested them. They would have said something. That child would have said something right away. That person is so nice. That child must be lying for attention. Kids don't make up sexual abuse. In fact, the statistic is that between 1% and 4% of all reported cases of sexual abuse are proven to be false disclosures. That means over 96% of disclosures are true disclosures. So we've got to stop telling kids, don't lie, don't make that up, it didn't happen. Don't say things about rabbi or teacher or neighbor or uncle. Kids don't tell because there's a lot of misplaced fear, shame, and guilt when a child's been molested. They think they did something wrong. And usually the molester or the offender is someone that they know and that the family cares about. So if I'm a kid, how can I tell my mom that this trusted adult did something to me? You're not going to believe me. Or I might get in trouble because I know it's not supposed to happen. That's how a kid thinks. They're afraid they're not going to be believed. They're filled with shame and guilt. And let me tell you something. If a child is molested, I don't care if that child is 5 years old or 15 years old, it is never the child's fault. Let me repeat that. It is never the child's fault if somebody sexually abuses them. It is the perpetrator's fault. So, kids won't tell unless they've been taught to. It's really simple. When we're talking to our kids about thumbs up and thumbs down touches, about private parts being private, we have to include something along the lines of, listen, sweetie, if somebody breaks our rule and tries a thumbs down touch, it's not your fault. I'll always believe you and you won't get in trouble. So tell mom or dad right away. That way we can stop it. Please don't keep a yucky uh-oh secret like that. But kids actually need to be taught that it's okay to tell. Otherwise, they won't. And we've seen it time and time again in news stories and in different disclosures where a child's been molested repeatedly for a number of years. It's because they didn't know. I could tell. They didn't know who they could tell. It's not enough to simply tell a child, nobody should touch your private parts. We actually have to tell them what to do if somebody tries. If we don't, they'll be like deer caught in the headlights. So, if kids are reluctant to tell, sometimes it's our job then to recognize signs of abuse. And there can be behavioral signs or physical signs. So, if you suddenly see some significant changes in a child's behavior, anxiety, depression, anger, that might be an indicator that something's going on and you need to step in. If suddenly your child has mood swings where that never happened before, or maybe they simply don't want to be in a certain environment or with a certain person, around a certain person. Recurring nightmares or regressing into infantile behavior. That means things like thumb sucking in an 8-year-old where they haven't done that in years, or bedwetting, for example. Those are physical indicators that something emotional, strong, and scary could be happening to the child. If there are drastic changes in their school behavior, if you suddenly see some kind of issue around food, whether it's overeating, restricting, and not eating at all, you might see signs of self-harm or mutilation. That is very indicative, especially in preteen and teenage girls. You might see difficulty sitting or walking, or you may see that your child suddenly is very self-conscious about their body, and they cover up all the time, even in very warm weather. They're wearing a lot of clothes and trying to downplay their appearance. Those are just some of the indicators that a child may be sexually abused or at risk for abuse. We're going to put up 2 slides right now. Take your time, pause on each one, and you can read through the list of other indicators of physical and behavioral signs of sexual abuse. Let's talk about boundaries for a few minutes and recognize when a boundary is getting a little blurry. For starters, molesters blur boundaries. They break rules. That's what a boundary is, a rule or a perimeter that should be in place. And when we're talking about safety of children, there are 3 types of boundaries that get blurry or mushy, as I like to call it. We're talking about physical boundaries, personal boundaries, and relationship boundaries. So, what are they and how can you tell if they're getting blurry? Let's take it one step at a time. A physical boundary is when somebody is excessively physical with a child. Too much hugging, kissing, tickling, stroking, accidental touching games, excessive physical touch. Now, I'm not saying hugging and tickling is bad, but who's initiating it? How long is it going on for? Does the child say, hey, stop, and that other person doesn't, or makes the child feel guilty? Are there accidental touching games? Those are a big favorite of predators, those accidental touching games, and a few minutes earlier you heard me mention the pocket game. So tickling games and wrestling games and games that involve different sorts of touches, that's what we're talking about when a physical boundary is blurry. When a physical boundary gets blurry, it means that that molester is trying to get the child used to their hands on the child's body. Molesters have said, I don't always go immediately for the private parts. Part of the grooming process is to get a child used to hands so that eventually those hands can move elsewhere. If a physical boundary is going out of bounds, you'll notice it. You'll see it with your own eyes and you'll look at it kind of funny, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Or your child may tell you about it. They may tell you about an uncomfortable touch or that they don't like when a certain person insists on hugging or tickling. When a child's telling you that they're getting an uh-oh feeling from a physical touch, what they're saying is, I need a little backup here. Can you keep an eye on this? Our job, if we're going to minimize opportunity and minimize risk, is to call people on it if they seem to be blurring a physical boundary. So just ask yourself, does the touch make sense? Is it excessive? You know, I don't go crazy if my mom wants to hug my daughter and squeeze her cheeks, but I might not like that kind of touch if it's coming from someone else in the family or someone not in the family. So be mindful of who's touching. The next boundary that will get kind of mushy or out of bounds is a personal boundary. And this is when people use different types of language around you or your child to see if you're going to say anything. Like, "Ooh, Maria, you look sexy today." Remember Mr. Norton? He was blurring a personal boundary. It's a way that they test to see if you've caught it. And molesters are pretty sure of themselves, pretty confident, and pretty clever. And they will say things and blur personal boundaries right in front of you. A personal boundary blur is when somebody sets up some kind of a secretive relationship with your child. Pay attention to who your child talks about. If your child comes home and says things like, "Oh, my teacher says I'm their favorite one and we have a special secret relationship," or "a special relationship different than all the other kids in the classroom." Well, you want to pay attention to that because that special or secretive relationship may mean that somebody's got their eye on your kid. Another personal boundary blur would be when someone makes you feel guilty when you say something to them. A personal boundary blur could be using inappropriate words around your kids. So if your kids are used to using the anatomically correct words for body parts and suddenly they come home with new names for those body parts, somebody's been introducing that language. You want to ask who it is. Did they hear it on the playground? Or did they hear it from their cousin who was babysitting? It's definitely worth asking about, okay? So personal boundary blurs, well, they kind of make you go, yuck, or uh-oh, rather quickly. The same with physical boundary blurs. You see them for yourself or your child tells you about it, and you kind of get an uh-oh feeling right away. Now, here's the tricky part. Tricky, for lack of a better word. The tricky part is knowing when a relationship boundary is going out of bounds. People will develop relationships with your children over the years. And just because someone has a relationship with your child doesn't mean they're a molester. But are they adhering to the relationship boundaries that should be in place? So, very simply, a soccer coach teaches your kid how to run, kick a ball, and score a goal on the team. They don't take your kid out for ice cream all by himself or take your kid on a sleepover to a soccer game in another town because your kid is their favorite or the best one on the team. They don't provide transportation for one child. The soccer coach shouldn't say things to you like, "You know what, you live so close to me. I know you have to work late or it's hard for you to get out here in time, so I'll give your child a ride home." Remember, people who work with your kids are not looking for more alone time with your kids. What about the camp counselor? Camp counselor's job or relationship with your child is to ensure that your child has a safe, enjoyable time at camp. They're not supposed to shower with your child or change in front of your child. A camp counselor or anyone in a supervisory position should never be naked or unclothed in front of the children they're caring for. Camp counselors don't babysit for free because they love your kid. Camp counselors don't take one kid on an outing while all the other campers stay with the group. A camp counselor doesn't use sexual innuendo, especially around preteens or teenagers in their care. And that's a big, blurry boundary, especially with a preteen or a teenager who's already going through puberty or starting to think of their bodies in a different way. And a predator knows that. A molester knows that. And so they may introduce ideas, language, teasing in a sexual way. That's why it's important to download information when your kid comes home from camp. And we'll talk more about camps in a separate video. So what about the music teacher? Well, the music teacher's job is to teach your kid music. You pay him, he teaches your kid music. He doesn't do it for free. And he doesn't take your kid to a concert so your child can see a big fancy concert live. It should also be in an observable environment. Remember, safe adults who work with kids or interact with kids, we want to be in an observable environment so there can be no questions about what's going on. So if you've got a guitar teacher who comes to your house and insists that he teaches your daughter behind closed doors, get a new guitar teacher and say something. Or you're going to sit right there in that room with the guitar teacher. Because that's a relationship boundary. Going out of bounds. What's your neighbor, your friend, your relative's relationship boundary? Well, their boundary is to respect yours when you put it in place. So if you say to Uncle Creepy, Maria doesn't want you hugging her right now. Maria wants to give you a high five. Or please stop tickling because it's obvious that the kid doesn't like it. And that person makes you feel guilty or starts challenging you. Well, that's a relationship going out of bounds. Your neighbors and friends and relatives don't have to agree with the boundaries you have in place, but they do have to respect them. You're the parent. And please know, especially when that person is within the family, they will use those guilt tactics to undermine a parent, a well-meaning parent. And suddenly you start doubting yourself. Don't. So that gives you an idea about relationships and physical and personal boundaries. Just remember, a boundary is a rule, and molesters break rules. So if a boundary seems to be going out of bounds, scale it back in, okay? Usually at this time of the program, people think, oh my goodness, I can't trust anybody. I'm never leaving the house. I'm going to lock my kid in his room and he's never going out. This is not what we're going for. This is not what we're aiming for here. In fact, people are always surprised when I say, you can pretty much trust everyone within the boundaries that they should have with your kid. Let's face it, there are millions of people out there in the world. Most of them are not molesters. So let's not be crazy people about this. But it is important to recognize when the limits or the boundaries are going out of bounds. Earlier I said I would share a good story about how I do trust my daughter's tennis coach with her alone. And here's why. When Maria first started taking tennis from our tennis coach, Jay, in the beginning, I would go on the lesson with Maria, and I had introduced myself to Jay, and I said, hi, Jay, I'm Maria's mom. We love talking about tennis. Such a tennis family. I can't wait to hear how you're going to teach her to serve. I didn't say, are you a molester? Tempting as it is. I didn't say that. I simply put a vibe out that I'm an involved parent and that my kid and I talk. I would say things to Jay like, Jay, do you mind if I hang out for 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of the lesson? Or do you mind if I come a few minutes early and catch the last part of the lesson? And Jay always has the right answer. Sure, stay, come back, whatever you want, no big deal. A molester will tell you why you can't do it. And they're going to make it sound really important, like they know better than you. If Jay was a molester, he might say something like, oh, you know, I've been teaching this a long time, and I know that it's a lot of pressure when parents are watching, when kids feel they have to perform for their parents. So I insist, no parents. And I don't want you to come early because that's going to make your child nervous. And besides, we're probably not even going to be on this tennis court. We'll probably be on the other side of the park. So you should come about 10 minutes after the lesson. Make sure we're back here. That's what a molester would say as part of their grooming and part of their trickery. Wouldn't it be convenient to tell me to come 10 minutes after the lesson? Then you know exactly when I'm going to show up, and you know how much time you have with my kid. But Jay doesn't say that. His response is exactly what I want it to be when I give him my test. He says, come whenever you want, sure, no problem. He doesn't offer to teach for free. Be mindful of people who are offering freebies that they would typically be paid for when it comes to teaching your kid. He doesn't offer to teach Maria for free. He wants his check at the first of the month. And he doesn't give extra lessons between other clients. So he's not offering freebies. He lets me be around whenever I want. He lets me He doesn't blur boundaries. He doesn't offer a ride home to Marissa because we live so close. I can introduce myself and put out my visible vibe that I'm an involved parent. He doesn't say things like, Maria needs a new racket. I want to get her this really special one. It's about $75, but she's so worth it. No. You know what he says? Patty, Maria needs a new racket. I know where you can get one for $75. That's what he says. So do I trust Jay? Absolutely, because he's not blurring boundaries. But before I let Maria even have that alone time, I had to make sure Maria understood thumbs up and thumbs down touches. I had a conversation with her about, Maria, when you're with Jay, if you get an uh-oh feeling or a thumbs down touch, or he does anything that makes you feel yucky, just tell him, knock it off, or stop. And then tell me all about it, and I'll talk to him for you. So I made sure my kid understood ahead of time what's okay or not okay. I told her, Jay teaches you tennis. He doesn't take you to the bathroom, and he doesn't take you out for ice cream and cut the lesson early so that you guys can go on a little outing. So for the beginning, I stayed and I watched the lessons, and I felt pretty good. And every now and then, I still ask Maria, do you ever get an uh-oh feeling from Jay at tennis because he just does something weird or yucky? And she rolls her eyes at me and she goes, no, Mom, I don't get the uh-oh feeling, it's fine. And that's what you want. You want your kid to look at you like, no, it's fine. So when your kid does roll their eyes at you, here's a tip. Don't get crazy and get all mad. Roll your eyes back at them. It's a great way for them to know you're on the same team together, and it lightens everything up. So when she rolls her eyes and says, no, Mom, it's fine, I say, well, I'm so glad because I'm your mom. I still have to ask. And there you go. So do I trust Jay? Yes. Somebody else, maybe not so much. So keep it in context and use common sense. Okay? Okay, what about sleepovers, camps, after-school activities, drop-off play dates? Well, eventually, your kid is going to be somewhere without you, whether it's a play date, a sleepover, or camp. Your child has to know how to be in the world without you. And I'm not the kind of person who says we should either be helicopter parents or free-range parents. It's a middle ground. It's a balance. Before you let your child have the independence to go on a sleepover, a sleepaway camp, a play date at somebody else's house where you just drop them off, you need to do your due diligence. That means, who's going to be there? Who's supervising? Parents? Babysitter? Is that parent the kind of parent who thinks it's okay to let the gardener do the babysitting while the mom goes grocery shopping? Ask, who's supervising while my kid is there? A good parent isn't going to mind that you ask. What else should you know before you let your kid go off? Well, is there any substance abuse in that household? I'm not saying that substance abusers always molest kids, but it makes for bad judgment. So I need to know the families. And if I know that maybe you or your husband or someone else in that family is abusing a substance, I don't want my kid in a risky environment there. So that play date is going to have to be at my house. Does your child know about thumbs up and thumbs down touches and how to exit? Do they know how to say hands off? Do they know that they can call you anytime and you'll come and pick them up without getting angry and without it being a big deal? Kids need to know your safety net is in place. What about older siblings? What are those older siblings like? You know, for a 7-year-old girl, I'm not crazy about her doing a sleepover where there's a preteen or a teenage boy. And that may not sound politically correct, but when it comes to keeping kids safe from sexual abuse, PC does not come into the equation. So be mindful. Who's in that house? What have I talked to my kids about? Are there people there who seem overly sexualized or way too into my kid? Has anybody there ever given me an uh-oh feeling? In terms of camps, are the kids separate from the younger kids separate from the older kids? Who's sleeping where? Who supervises? What's the policies for changing? Are kids allowed privacy? I always like the rule of 2. There should be 2 supervisors monitoring the kids and the activities. So it doesn't mean you can't let your kid go on a sleepover, a play date, an after-school activity, or camp. But do your due diligence first. Ask the right questions. Make sure that you talk to your kid about what's okay and what's not okay. And when it's over, when your kid comes back, download that information so that you know what it was like while they were there. Make sense? Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this presentation. We've talked about tricky people. We've talked about warning signs, grooming, boundaries getting blurry. We've even talked a little bit about the kind of language we should use, especially with young children when we're trying to start that safety conversation. So how do you talk to kids about such a delicate subject? I hear this all the time. I don't want to talk to my kids about this. I don't want to steal their innocence. If you empower your child, you won't steal their innocence. In fact, they'll be able to hold on to their innocence longer because they're smarter and they're educated. I'll tell you what takes away a child's innocence: a molester who touches them inappropriately. So, how do you talk to kids about such a delicate subject? Well, take your time. You don't have to teach your child everything all at once. I know a lot of people watching this video may think, oh my goodness, we've got a lot of ground to cover, and you're going to keep your kid up all night. That's not the way to go. Start slowly. Introduce some safety rules. Introduce the Super 10 safety rules for kids and grown-ups, because grown-ups have to follow rules too. The number 1 rule, I'm the boss of my body. Start teaching your kid, you own this thing. You're the boss of it. Even young kids understand what a boss is. A boss makes sure that everybody's doing the right thing and a boss is in charge. So let your child know, being the boss of your body means that you can decide who can touch you and who can't touch you. And you can say, stop touching me to anybody, boss. And that boss of my body concept works when your kid's 5 years old or when they're 15. The only thing that's going to change is probably the way you deliver the message. When your kid is 5 years old, you'll probably say it in kind of a soft, nurturing way. Remember, you're the boss of your body. And then your kid gets a little older and you're a little more forthcoming. You're the boss of your body. You own it. Don't listen to what anybody else tries to tell you. So the concept's the same, just the delivery changes. There are 10 super safe rules that kids should know. Start out slowly. They should know when they're very young, name, address, cell phone number. One of the rules I like to teach kids, the helping rule. We teach children to be helpful, to be nice, but they need to know when it's okay to help and when it's not okay to help. Here's how I teach the helping rule. If we're at home and mom says, clean your room, I need some help around here, that's okay. But if you're out there in the world and somebody asks you for help because they need directions, or they need some assistance carrying a package, or they want to get some help with something in their car, stop. Get your safe adult before you help. Because the truth is, safe grown-ups don't ask kids for help. A safe adult gets assistance or help from another adult. One of the oldest tricks in the book. So, check first and the helping rule go together. It's important to teach your kids. Check first before you go anywhere or do anything. If Mr. Norton asks Maria for help with something in his garage, I have to make sure Maria knows. I gotta check first. So when you start teaching the helping rule, you can teach the check first rule right along with it. For older kids, make sure you teach them that they shouldn't go anywhere or do anything with somebody they don't know, no matter what that person says. Kids have been tricked because people are friendly. Predators are friendly. And I don't want to pick on any religion or organization, but just because somebody wears a certain type of clothing does not mean we can just tell our children that person is safe. Uniforms don't ensure safety. Traditional different types of clothing don't ensure safety. So let's make sure that if a child doesn't know somebody, they're not going off with them just because they recognize something familiar. Okay? Another important rule, our privates are private. So when I'm teaching that to children, I simply want to remind them, if you're the boss, your private parts are private. And nobody should try and play any kind of touching game with the private parts on your body, and nobody should ask you to touch the private parts on their body. And then I always follow it up with, most people know this rule, so I don't want you to worry about it. But if somebody tries the old private parts trick, and they try and tell you it's okay, you're the boss, you know better. Uh-oh, hands off my private parts, and then go tell your safe grown-up right away. So these are ways that you can start to teach your child in the language that I use when I'm in a classroom and that I know is actually effective, meaningful, and non-fearful. Make sure your kids know the difference between a surprise and a secret. No secrets from our parents, especially if it's a secret that makes you feel yucky or it's about a thumbs down touch. No secrets like that from mom or dad. They shouldn't be too polite if they get an uh-oh feeling. I'm not saying we want to raise rude, obnoxious kids, but kids shouldn't be so afraid of doing the right thing and being so polite that they don't listen to their uh-oh feeling or say something to someone when they're approached or asked to do something that they know is not okay. So, they don't have to be too polite if somebody else breaks our family rules or gives us an uh-oh feeling. If a child ever gets lost in a public place, my rule is freeze and yell. Just stop and yell your parent's name or ask another mom with kids for help. Statistically, a mom with kids is the safest stranger in an emergency. And lastly, the number 10 rule is I always listen to my uh-oh feeling. And that's for us as parents as well as our kids. Listen to that uh-oh feeling, because the minute you start making excuses for somebody else's behavior, the minute that you start ignoring that uh-oh feeling or talking yourself out of it, it's a sure sign something's up. So listen to it. So that's a start in teaching your kids about safety, in approaching the subject. I like to start by telling kids most people in the world are safe, but now that you're growing up, we have to understand safety rules for kids and adults, and we have to know what's okay and not okay. To get the point across, I think books are a great idea. I've written a couple of children's books, and there's a couple of other books that I recommend as well, which you'll see on this slide. My books are No Trespassing, This Is My Body. It's for kids ages 3 to 8. The other book I've written is called Super Duper Safety School, and it's for kids ages 5 to 10 years old. Each page has a rule, and it has the kid-friendly language explaining that rule. So it pretty much tells you exactly what to say, or your kid can read it for themselves. In the back of each of my books is a parent guide with lots of good information for you, the parent. I also like a book called Some Secrets Should Never Be Kept. It's a book about not keeping secrets, and it's a book about who to tell if you have a yucky uh-oh secret. And there's one more book that I like. It's called I Said No. And it's about a little boy who went on a sleepover that didn't go well and how he had to handle it the next day with his mom. The books I recommend are very specific because there's a lot of material out there, but I want the material that's not going to scare the kids and that's going to be effective. You can buy these books on Amazon.com or click on the links in this video description. Please check out the safety tips for parents. You can pause right now and read that screen. It's got lots of tips for you, like don't force your kids to be physically affectionate on someone else's terms. Teach your kids the safety rules. Make sure that your kids understand what's okay and not okay. And be a visible parent. So, we've covered an awful lot of material in this video. Let's recap. Your job is to keep your child safe. How do you do that? Trust your instinct, let your child trust theirs. Build confidence in your child and empower them with the right information. Listen to your uh-oh feeling and let your child listen to theirs. Pay attention to the clues and cues in how somebody acts or speaks around your child and take action if you need to. This is not the time to be super polite or afraid to speak up. Take an action. Say something if you're getting an uh-oh feeling from a possible offender. Remember that 3-step approach we talked about in the beginning. Now we know the facts. Our job is to minimize the opportunity and communicate the right way with children. And like I said earlier, it's not rocket science. You can do this. Here are some resources, links, and references for more information. You can pause here and get any more information you'd like. And from all of us at JCW, thanks for watching.